October 1942, just 4 months after the United States shattered the Japanese fleet at Midway, Commander Joseph Rochefort arrived in Washington. The brilliant cryptanalyst expected a brief consultation before returning to Station HYPO in Hawaii. Instead, he was handed a shocking order. He was not going back. America's most valuable intelligence officer was being stripped of his post and sent to San Francisco to oversee the construction of a floating dry dock. At the height of a global war, the Navy was abruptly exiling the man who had just saved the Pacific Fleet. What could possibly drive the military to discard its sharpest mind? The answer lies not in the smoking wreckage of Japanese aircraft carriers, but in the quiet, polished corridors of power in Washington, D.C. This will not be another standard retelling of dive bombers, desperate dogfights, and the tactical miracle of Midway. Instead, we're going to uncover the real reason why the United States Navy deliberately engineered the downfall of the very man who made that ambush possible. This is the story of a hidden, ruthless, bureaucratic war fought entirely behind closed doors. It was a battle over a single, deeply uncomfortable prize. Who actually gets to claim authorship of a monumental American victory? On one side stood Admiral Chester Nimitz, a pragmatic fleet commander willing to gamble the survival of his remaining forces on the word of an unorthodox codebreaker. On the other side stood an entrenched naval high command, far more concerned with preserving its own prestige and institutional control. It became a bitter clash between the actual architects of the triumph and the powerful system determined to dictate the official narrative. To comprehend how an intelligence victory so profound could trigger such an immediate institutional revenge, we have to look past the battle itself. We must rewind the clock to the desperate months before Midway, where the internal war for control of America's secrets was already raging. In the spring of 1942, the nerve center of the Pacific Fleet's intelligence apparatus did not look like a place where the fate of the free world would be decided. It was a stifling, windowless, concrete basement situated directly beneath the 14th Naval District Administration Building in the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. Known to the men who worked there simply as the dungeon, the space was guarded by heavily armed Marines behind steel vault doors. Inside, the air was permanently heavy with the smell of stale coffee, damp paper, and thick cigarette smoke. The constant deafening clatter of early IBM tabulating machines echoed off the low ceiling. At the center of this organized chaos was Commander Joseph Rochefort, the head of the cryptanalytic unit known as Station HYPO. Rochefort was an eccentric, exhausted genius who had spent 3 years living in Japan, immersing himself in the language and culture until he could practically think like an Imperial Navy officer. By May 1942, he was working 20-hour shifts, sleeping on a cot between decoding machines, and subsisting on a diet of black coffee and adrenaline. Suffering from ulcers and the relentless dampness of the basement, Rochefort frequently worked wearing an old red smoking jacket and a pair of worn-out slippers. He cared absolutely nothing for naval protocol, polished brass, or the strict rigidities of the military chain of command. He cared only about breaking the Japanese naval code, known as JN-25. More importantly, Rochefort possessed a unique operational setup. Through his close friend and immediate superior, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet's chief intelligence officer, Rochefort had a direct, unfiltered line to Admiral Chester Nimitz. When HYPO uncovered a piece of the Japanese puzzle, Rochefort did not route it through a maze of committees. Layton simply walked upstairs and placed it on Nimitz's desk. More than 5,000 miles away, in the manicured offices of the main Navy building on Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C., this direct access was viewed with deep suspicion and mounting hostility. There sat OP-20G, the Centralized Communication Intelligence Division of the United States Navy, commanded by Commander John Redman, whose brother, Captain Joseph Redman, was the Assistant Director of Naval Communications. OP-20-G represented the powerful, entrenched Beltway establishment. They were highly resourced, fiercely protective of their proximity to high command, and absolutely obsessed with bureaucratic order. The philosophy of OP-20G was simple. All intelligence must be centralized in Washington. In their view, field stations like HYPO on Hawaii or Station CAST in the Philippines were merely supposed to be collection nodes. Their job was to intercept raw Japanese radio traffic, package it, and transmit it to the capital, where the real experts in Washington would analyze the data, decipher the meaning, and present a unified, polished intelligence assessment to the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. fleet, Admiral Ernest King. But Rochefort flatly refused to play the role of a passive radio antenna. He believed that raw intercepts meant nothing without the localized, intuitive context that only his team in the Pacific could provide. He intercepted, decoded, analyzed, and briefed Nimitz directly, effectively bypassing the Washington apparatus altogether. To the Redmond brothers and the analysts at OP-20G, this was not just a breach of protocol, it was rogue behavior by an unmanageable field officer. Washington believed that the Pearl Harbor Command had already failed the nation once on December 7th, and they were not inclined to trust a sleep-deprived maverick in a basement with the strategic direction of the Pacific War. This simmering jurisdictional friction violently boiled over in the crucial weeks of May 1942. The Japanese were preparing a massive, multi-pronged naval offensive across the Pacific, and their radio traffic was spiking. Only about 10 to 15% of the JN-25 code was actually readable at the time. The rest was a shadowy landscape of mathematical pattern recognition, traffic analysis, and educated intuition. Through the static, one specific geographic designator began appearing over and over in Yamamoto's intercepted operational orders: AF. Rochefort and his team at HYPO meticulously cross-referenced the new intercepts with months of older data. They remembered a March 1942 message where a Japanese Kawanishi flying boat had requested a flight path near AF. Looking at the map, Rochefort confidently declared that AF could only mean one place, the tiny, isolated American outpost of Midway Atoll. When HYPO transmitted this assessment to Washington, OP-20G vehemently rejected it. The analysts in the capital pushed back hard, asserting that Admiral Yamamoto would never commit his combined fleet to such an insignificant speck of coral. Washington formulated its own alternative theories. They argued that AF was likely Johnston Atoll, or perhaps Port Moresby in New Guinea, the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, or even a direct assault on the west coast of the United States. The disagreement instantly escalated from an academic debate into a high-stakes administrative war. OP-20-G did not just politely disagree with Rochefort, they actively sought to discredit him. Washington dispatched formal warnings to Nimitz, explicitly stating that Station HYPO was suffering from localitis, an inability to see the big picture. They told Nimitz that Rochefort was misreading the fragmented intelligence, relying too much on dangerous guesswork, and playing right into Japanese hands. For Admiral Nimitz, the pressure was nearly crushing. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, the United States Pacific Fleet was hanging by a thread. He had exactly two fully operational aircraft carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet, while the Yorktown was limping back to Pearl Harbor, trailing a miles-long oil slick and requiring months of repair that she would never get. If Nimitz followed Rochefort's advice and rushed his last remaining flight decks to Midway, and Washington turned out to be right, the American carriers would be completely out of position. They would be annihilated, the Pacific would fall, and the West Coast would be left completely defenseless. Washington explicitly warned the Pacific Fleet commander that trusting the rogue basement team over the centralized intelligence apparatus would lead his remaining ships into a fatal ambush. Nimitz was inclined to trust Leighton and Rochefort, but the institutional weight of Washington's opposition was too heavy to ignore. He could not commit the survival of the United States Navy on a hunch that his own high command actively opposed. Before he could issue the final orders to sail, Nimitz needed something that transcended analysis, intuition, and bureaucratic infighting. He needed absolute, undeniable proof that AF was Midway, a piece of evidence so airtight that it would forcefully silence the Beltway establishment and justify risking everything he had left. To get the undeniable proof Admiral Nimitz so desperately needed, Rochefort and his subordinate, Jasper Holmes, engineered a remarkably simple but ingenious trap. If they couldn't force Washington to believe their analysis, they would force the Japanese to confirm it for them. In mid-May 1942, Rochefort used a secure underwater telegraph cable to contact the American base on Midway Atoll. He instructed the garrison commander to transmit a very specific, entirely fake radio message in plain, unencrypted English. The message was to state that Midway's seawater distillation plant had suffered a catastrophic breakdown, and the base was now experiencing a critical shortage of fresh water. It was a piece of raw, tactical bait cast directly into the Pacific ether. Back in the stifling basement of Station HYPO, Rochefort's codebreakers put on their headphones and waited. For 2 agonizing days, they listened to the static, wondering if the Japanese listening posts had even noticed the transmission. Then, the trap snapped shut. American listening stations picked up an urgent encrypted radio dispatch sent from a Japanese intelligence node on Kwajalein, routed directly to High Command in Tokyo. Rochefort's exhausted team tore into the intercept. When the decryption emerged from the typewriters, it was absolute gold. It read, "AF is short of water." The debate was instantly over. Rochefort handed the decrypt to Edwin Layton, who marched it directly upstairs to Nimitz. There was no more room for Washington's alternative theories. A F was Midway. The rogue field officers had just definitively outsmarted the centralized intelligence apparatus of the United States Navy. Armed with this irrefutable proof, Nimitz made the ultimate gamble. He completely disregarded the lingering bureaucratic caution from Washington and committed everything he had left. He ordered his heavily outnumbered task forces, including the miraculously patched-up carrier Yorktown, to sail to a specific patch of empty ocean known as Point Luck. They were to wait exactly when and where Rochefort had predicted the Japanese would appear. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the American fleet sprang the ambush. While the details of the ensuing combat have become legend, the strategic outcome was absolute. Within a few chaotic hours, American dive bombers turned 4 elite Japanese fleet carriers into burning, sinking scrap. The seemingly invincible Imperial Japanese Navy was gutted in a single afternoon. The victory at Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War, and it was entirely predicated on the intelligence provided by Station HYPO. Rochefort's basement team had executed the greatest cryptanalytic coup in naval history. They had saved the fleet and handed Nimitz the tools for a miraculous victory. By any conventional military logic, Joseph Rochefort should have been immediately decorated, promoted, and hailed as a national hero. He had just proven that his localized, direct-to-commander intelligence model was vastly superior to the centralized bureaucracy of Washington. But that was exactly the problem. In the polished corridors of the main Navy building, the analysts and commanders of OP-20G were not celebrating Rochefort's genius. They were seething over their own humiliation. A tired, eccentric officer in a Hawaiian basement had just exposed the Beltway establishment as fundamentally wrong. And in Washington, being proven wrong by a subordinate is a sin that the system almost never forgives. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Midway should have been a moment of unified, unadulterated national jubilation. Inside the cavernous, heavily guarded corridors of the main Navy building on Constitution Avenue, the atmosphere was electric with the frantic energy of incoming dispatches. Ticker tapes and teletype machines were relentlessly chattering, printing out unbelievable, almost mythical damage assessments arriving from the Pacific Theater. 4 elite Japanese fleet carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, were burning, sinking, or already resting at the bottom of the ocean. The seemingly invincible spearhead of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor exactly 6 months earlier, had been entirely shattered in a single afternoon. But within the highly secure, restricted confines of OP-20G, the centralized Naval Communications Intelligence Division, the mood was not one of celebration. Instead, the atmosphere was incredibly dark, profoundly defensive, and increasingly toxic. Commander John Redman, a communications officer who knew very little about actual cryptanalysis but possessed a masterful grasp of bureaucratic leverage, and his influential brother, Captain Joseph Redman, the Assistant Director of Naval Communications, were staring at a monumental institutional catastrophe. Their entire doctrine of centralized intelligence, the absolute, unwavering conviction that only Washington had the resources, the intellect, and the authority to decipher enemy intentions, had just been blown to pieces by a rogue cryptanalyst operating out of a damp basement 5,000 miles away. For months leading up to the battle, the centralized apparatus of OP-20G had aggressively marginalized Joseph Rochefort. They had flooded the Pacific Command with official, high-level warnings that Station HYPO was suffering from a dangerous case of localitis, a dismissive, patronizing term meant to imply that the Hawaiian codebreakers were too close to the war, too traumatized by the attack on Pearl Harbor to see the strategic big picture. Washington had definitively stated to Admiral Nimitz that the Japanese objective known as AF was not Midway Atoll. They had confidently argued that the Japanese offensive was a massive feint, and they had warned the Pacific Fleet commander that trusting Rochefort's localized analysis would send the last remaining American aircraft carriers into a fatal, blinding ambush off the coast of Hawaii or the West Coast. Now, the smoking, submerged ruins of the Japanese striking force proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Washington had been spectacularly, dangerously wrong. In the brutal zero-sum economy of wartime Washington politics, admitting a failure of that magnitude was tantamount to institutional suicide. If the United States Navy officially acknowledged that Joseph Rochefort and his small, insubordinate, overworked team had orchestrated this unprecedented intelligence coup, OP-20G would be completely exposed as incompetent. To concede that Station HYPO possessed a vastly superior grasp of the Japanese JN-25 cipher would mean relinquishing central control, losing departmental funding, sacrificing prestige, and surrendering their immediate proximity to the ultimate power of the High Command. They simply could not allow the factual narrative to stand on its own merits. If the central intelligence apparatus was to survive the war with its authority intact, Station HYPO could not be permitted to become the undisputed hero of Midway. The official narrative of the victory had to be aggressively and immediately controlled, and the true, brilliant architects of the ambush had to be quietly, systematically neutralized. Meanwhile, halfway across the globe, the Japanese High Command was experiencing an equally terrifying realization, one that inadvertently and powerfully validated everything Joseph Rochefort had achieved. Aboard the massive, heavily armored super battleship Yamato, anchored far to the rear of the main striking force, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the flag bridge, receiving the staggered, increasingly desperate radio transmissions from his dying carrier fleet. Just days earlier, the mood aboard the Yamato had been one of supreme, untouchable confidence. The Japanese Imperial Navy operated under the absolute institutional belief that their JN-25B naval code was a mathematical fortress. They had updated the codebooks just weeks before the battle, creating what they believed was an impenetrable cryptographic shield that guaranteed total operational security. They had sailed toward the Central Pacific, expecting to surprise an unprepared, isolated American garrison at Midway, fully intending to draw the battered, outnumbered remnants of the United States Pacific Fleet out of Pearl Harbor and annihilate them in a final, decisive ambush. Instead, the ambush had been entirely, violently reversed. American dive bombers had materialized out of the cloud cover at the exact moment the Japanese carriers were rearming and refueling their strike aircraft, the absolute, fleeting point of maximum vulnerability. The Americans had known the target. They had known the precise date, they had known the exact direction of the Japanese approach, and they had positioned their own carriers perfectly to exploit it. As the horrifying reality of the slaughter settled over the veteran officers aboard the Yamato, the initial shock of the tactical defeat was quickly eclipsed by a much deeper, colder, and more permanent dread. The sheer mathematical precision of the American ambush could not possibly be attributed to luck, nor could it be explained away by a rogue American reconnaissance plane stumbling upon the fleet. There was only one logical, inescapable conclusion. Their operational security had been fatally, fundamentally compromised from the inside out. The Americans were reading their mail. This quiet, devastating realization by the highest levels of the Japanese command was the ultimate, unvarnished testament to Joseph Rochefort's genius. Station HYPO had not just made an educated, lucky guess. They had completely dismantled the cryptographic shield of the Imperial fleet. By recognizing that their most highly classified, secure communications were completely transparent to the enemy, the Japanese High Command was silently confirming exactly what Washington desperately wanted to deny. Rochefort's localized, intuitive cryptanalysis was undeniably the deadliest, most effective weapon in the entire Pacific theater, and the Japanese realized they had been entirely exposed by an adversary they could not even see. Back in Washington, this undeniable reality of Rochefort's operational success forced OP-20G to immediately pivot their tactics. They recognized that they could not dispute the strategic victory itself. The sunken enemy carriers were an irrefutable physical fact, so they decided to dispute the organizational management of the men who had made it possible. The intense professional rivalry that had simmered just below the surface before Midway rapidly morphed into a relentless, highly coordinated campaign of administrative warfare. The Redmond brothers understood perfectly that the military bureaucracy was a battlefield just as lethal as the Pacific Ocean, and they began weaponizing the administrative system with devastating efficiency. They did not attack Rochefort's cryptanalytic skills directly, as that would be impossible to prove. Instead, they attacked his chain of command, his unconventional methods, and his professional character. OP-20G began flooding the desks of the highest-ranking admirals in the Navy with meticulously crafted memos, official complaints, and deeply critical performance evaluations specifically targeting Station HYPO. The accusations were brilliantly designed to trigger Washington's deepest, most ingrained institutional fears. They formally characterized the Hawaiian Intelligence Center as a rogue, undisciplined operation, plagued by poor management, a complete lack of military decorum, and dangerous insubordination. The Redmonds argued in official reports that Rochefort was selfishly hoarding vital enemy intercepts, refusing to share raw decrypts with the Capitol's analysts, and running a secretive, localized fiefdom that answered to no one but itself. To permanently fix this manufactured crisis, OP-20G proposed a sweeping, fundamental reorganization of the entire naval intelligence structure. They aggressively lobbied for a new, rigid doctrine that would permanently separate the act of cryptanalysis from the act of intelligence evaluation. Under this proposed, highly centralized system, field stations like HYPO would be reduced to mere translation and interception hubs. Their only permitted job would be to decipher the raw Japanese characters and immediately forward them to Washington without comment. The actual meaning of those messages, the strategic analysis, the tactical predictions, and the exclusive right to brief top commanders would be strictly reserved for the central apparatus at OP-20G. It was a brilliantly disguised, perfectly executed bureaucratic chokehold. The proposed reorganization was absolutely not about improving the flow of intelligence during a world war. It was specifically designed to sever the direct, unfiltered line of communication between Joseph Rochefort and Admiral Nimitz, effectively blindfolding the Pacific Fleet commander and forcing him to rely entirely on Washington. Admiral Chester Nimitz, operating from his headquarters overlooking the still-scarred waters of Pearl Harbor, clearly saw the political maneuvering emanating from the capital and attempted to definitively preempt the bureaucratic assassination of his chief codebreaker. On June 8, 1942, a mere 4 days after the decisive dive bomber strikes that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Second World War, Nimitz took highly unusual, proactive administrative action. He formally recommended Commander Joseph Rochefort for the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. This was not a routine commendation or a standard end-of-tour ribbon. It was the highest non-combat decoration the United States Navy could possibly award. It was a medal exclusively reserved for officers whose exceptionally meritorious service in a duty of great responsibility directly and profoundly altered the course of national events. Nimitz's accompanying official citation pulled no punches and left no room for bureaucratic ambiguity. It explicitly, undeniably, credited Rochefort's exhaustive, brilliant code-breaking, his relentless personal dedication, and his incredibly precise tactical predictions as the fundamental, indispensable bedrock of the Midway victory. But in the United States military establishment, even a victorious fleet commander's recommendation must survive the labyrinth of Washington's rigid approval process. The citation eventually landed on the polished mahogany desk of Admiral Ernest King, the fiercely territorial, famously abrasive Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet and Chief of Naval Operations. Admiral King was a man who demanded absolute, unquestioning adherence to the centralized chain of command, making him naturally, philosophically, aligned with the centralized communication structure championed by the Redmond brothers. When King read Nimitz's recommendation, he outright rejected it. The denial of Rochefort's medal was not a clerical oversight, a request for more information, or a temporary delay for further review. It was a cold, calculated, and final administrative execution. In the rigid hierarchy and tradition of the armed forces, high-level medals do far more than simply reward individual heroism. They establish the permanent, unalterable, official historical record. If Joseph Rochefort was formally awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his specific actions at Midway, the United States Navy would be permanently, legally documenting that Station HYPO, and decidedly not the centralized apparatus in Washington, was entirely responsible for the greatest intelligence triumph in American military history. By denying the decoration, Washington was effectively erasing Rochefort's name from the official victory narrative before the ink could even dry. They were aggressively rewriting history, while the smell of cordite and burning oil still hung heavily in the air over the Pacific, ensuring that the central apparatus would eventually absorb the total credit for a strategic victory they had actively, vehemently tried to prevent. Commander Rochefort, tragically, was uniquely unsuited to survive, let alone win, this kind of vicious, protracted bureaucratic knife fight. He was a pure savant of cryptanalysis, a man who lived entirely in the mathematical shadows of the Japanese language and the intricate logic of codes, but he was absolutely, stubbornly blind to the treacherous political currents of his own military organization. Instead of attempting to mend fences, demonstrate political deference to the capital, or compromise with the Redmond brothers, Rochefort exacerbated the hostility at every possible turn through his sheer, unyielding disregard for naval decorum and administrative protocol. While the intelligence officers in OP-20G wore perfectly pressed uniforms, adhered to strict schedules, and operated out of immaculate, sunlit offices in the capital, Rochefort continued to command his subterranean dungeon, wearing his frayed red smoking jacket and a pair of worn-out slippers. He was chronically exhausted, suffering from severe, bleeding stomach ulcers caused by stress, subsisting on black coffee, highly irritable, and openly, verbally dismissive of Washington's constantly escalating administrative demands. When OP-20G sent urgent administrative cables demanding daily logistical reports, standardized formatting for intercepts, and strict adherence to new communication protocols, Rochefort simply ignored them. He argued passionately to his exhausted staff that he was entirely too busy actually fighting the Japanese Empire to fill out redundant paperwork for men who had nearly lost the war just weeks prior. When he was forced to respond to Washington's inquiries, his messages were characterized by a blunt, condescending brevity that absolutely infuriated the senior officers at the main Navy building. Rochefort operated under a fundamentally flawed, deeply naive assumption about how the military actually functioned. He firmly believed that his only duty was to provide actionable, life-saving intelligence to Admiral Chester Nimitz. He genuinely thought that as long as his intelligence was flawlessly accurate, and as long as the commander of the Pacific Fleet was satisfied with his performance, he was entirely untouchable by the bureaucrats. It was a fatal, career-ending miscalculation. Rochefort failed to understand that in the relentless, grinding machinery of the military establishment, being objectively right does not protect you from being ruined. In fact, being proven right when your influential superiors are proven disastrously wrong is often the most dangerous, unforgivable position an officer can possibly hold. His intentionally abrasive personality, his absolute refusal to play the political game, and his open disdain for the centralized chain of command gave the Redmond brothers exactly the ammunition they needed to paint him not as a misunderstood genius, but as an erratic, unmanageable, and dangerous liability to the Navy. The relentless, cold personnel machinery of Washington was now actively, methodically grinding down the very man who had just saved the Pacific Fleet from total annihilation. And out in Pearl Harbor, sitting behind his desk at Pacific Fleet headquarters, Admiral Nimitz was slowly, painfully, waking up to a deeply chilling reality. The pragmatic, soft-spoken Texan had just successfully orchestrated the greatest, most decisive naval victory of the 20th century, relying entirely on a localized operational culture where sheer competence mattered infinitely more than rank or protocol. But as the hostile administrative memos continued to pile up on his desk, and as his direct, personal requests for his own officers were repeatedly denied by the capital, Nimitz began to realize that his absolute operational command of the Pacific Ocean did not extend to the personnel offices of Washington. Despite all his stars, despite the burning Japanese carriers at the bottom of the sea, the victorious fleet commander was being quietly, systematically outmaneuvered by the invisible, unforgiving hands of his own high command. The administrative purge did not happen through a dramatic court-martial or a public firing. In Washington, institutional revenge is executed through the slow, suffocating application of organizational restructuring. By the late summer of 1942, OP-20G formally proposed a sweeping consolidation of all naval intelligence. Under the guise of wartime efficiency, they drafted new directives that legally stripped Station HYPO of its autonomy. The Pearl Harbor basement was ordered to act strictly as a raw collection node. They were explicitly forbidden from generating independent strategic analysis, and, more importantly, they were barred from delivering intelligence directly to the Pacific Fleet Command without Washington's prior approval. For Admiral Nimitz, This bureaucratic maneuver exposed a paralyzing paradox. He possessed the absolute authority to order entire task forces into lethal combat, to bombard enemy shorelines, and to dictate the tactical movements of tens of thousands of sailors across millions of square miles of ocean. Yet, sitting in his own headquarters, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet discovered he could not control the personnel roster of his own intelligence basement. Nimitz had built his Pacific Command on a singular, uncompromising rule. Raw competence mattered infinitely more than rank or protocol. But he now realized that this rule instantly evaporated the moment it crossed into the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Naval Personnel. Nimitz attempted to fight back, dispatching terse, defensive cables to the capital. As the brutal Guadalcanal campaign loomed, he argued that altering a highly functioning, combat-proven intelligence unit in the middle of an active offensive was operational suicide. But the Redmond brothers and their Beltway allies held the ultimate trump cards. They controlled the departmental budgets, the promotion boards, and the official transfer orders. By attacking Rochefort purely through administrative compliance, burying him in official reprimands for ignoring new reporting protocols, Washington completely bypassed Nimitz's operational authority. The fleet commander was forced into a brutal, pragmatic corner. He was managing a fragile, escalating war of attrition in the South Pacific, and he desperately needed Washington's continuous flow of ships, planes, and political support to survive. He simply could not afford to wage an all-out institutional civil war against the Navy Department over a single, notoriously stubborn cryptanalyst. The Beltway machinery had successfully isolated its target. Despite his profound gratitude and loyalty to the man who had handed him his greatest victory, Nimitz faced the cold finality that he was entirely powerless to shield his best codebreaker from the vengeance of the system. The execution finally came in October 1942. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches, and no formal charges of insubordination. The machinery of Washington simply processed the paperwork. Joseph Rochefort was summoned to the Capitol under the pretense of a routine, temporary consultation. When he walked into the main Navy building, the administrative trap quietly snapped shut. He was handed official orders detaching him permanently from Station HYPO. The man who had cracked the cryptographic armor of the Japanese Empire, an intelligence officer operating at the absolute, unparalleled peak of his abilities, was ordered to report to a shipyard in San Francisco. His new assignment was to oversee the construction of a floating dry dock. It was a breathtakingly cynical reassignment. The High Command was not just removing Rochefort from his Hawaiian basement, they were deliberately exiling him to an engineering yard, completely severing his connection to cryptanalysis, radio intelligence, and the operational theater of the Pacific. In the middle of a desperate global conflict, where every intercepted syllable was a matter of life and death, the Central Naval Command prioritized its own institutional vanity over military effectiveness. They intentionally discarded the nation's sharpest weapon simply because he refused to submit to their administrative control. Back in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz received the finalized transfer orders. He did not issue a countermand. He did not threaten to resign. He simply authorized the paperwork. For the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, it was a profound, deeply personal moral defeat. Nimitz had built his command and his miraculous victory at Midway on the unwavering conviction that raw, undeniable competence should always outrank bureaucratic pedigree. Yet, as he watched his most vital intelligence officer be quietly erased from the board, Nimitz was forced to confront a humiliating, paralyzing reality. He possessed the staggering authority to dictate the violent course of a world war. He could hurl entire task forces into the fires of Guadalcanal and reshape the strategic map of the Pacific Ocean. But that immense, world-altering power completely vanished the exact moment it collided with the entrenched political survival instincts of his own organization. He was forced to stand by in sterile silence, effectively abandoning the eccentric, exhausted genius who had handed him the very victory that secured his own operational command. The system had won. Bureaucracy had effortlessly crushed individual brilliance, proving that a single, inconvenient truth is entirely defenseless against a unified administration determined to protect its own prestige. But the quiet tragedy of October 1942 did not end with a one-way train ticket to California. By purging Joseph Rochefort and silencing the brilliant codebreakers in Hawaii, The Beltway establishment had successfully monopolized the intelligence apparatus. They had secured their bureaucratic supremacy, but in doing so, they had fundamentally hijacked the official historical record, ensuring that the true cost of their institutional jealousy would echo through the remaining years of the war, and long after the guns finally fell silent. Joseph Rochefort spent the next 2 years supervising the assembly of steel plates in a San Francisco dry dock, miles away from the silent, invisible war of cryptanalysis. Although he was eventually brought back to Washington in 1944 for specialized intelligence work, it was in a strictly compartmentalized role, carefully engineered to ensure he never again wielded the kind of direct, independent influence he held before Midway. When the war ended, the Navy quietly handed him a Legion of Merit, a standard mid-level commendation that praised his administrative work but noticeably, intentionally omitted any specific reference to his world-altering achievements in the Pacific basement. For the system, the case was closed, the narrative secured, but Admiral Chester Nimitz never forgot the moral debt he owed. In 1958, 12 years after his own retirement, the aging fleet admiral launched a final, personal offensive against the Beltway machinery. He officially resubmitted the paperwork to award Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal, laying out the undeniable facts of the Midway intelligence coup. The Navy establishment, clinging to a bureaucratic fiction that had long since become institutional truth, coldly rejected the request once again. Nimitz, the architect of the greatest naval campaign in history, died knowing he had failed his best officer. The delayed justice finally arrived in 1985, 9 years after Rochefort's death, when President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded him the medal. But the decades of denial reveal the true, uncomfortable nature of wartime leadership. The United States military expertly weaponized Rochefort's eccentric genius precisely when national survival depended on it. Yet, the moment the crisis passed, that same system proved fundamentally incapable of admitting a devastating reality: that a defiant, exhausted outsider in a Hawaiian dungeon had been absolutely right, while the pristine, highly resourced intelligence apparatus of Washington had been dangerously wrong. The quiet tragedy of Station HYPO proves that the most ruthless battles in a global war are rarely fought against the enemy. They are fought in the polished corridors of headquarters, where the machinery of bureaucracy relentlessly rewrites history, ensuring that institutional pride will always, inevitably, outrank historical truth. Admiral Chester Nimitz commanded the greatest armada the world had ever seen and won the most consequential naval clash of the 20th century. But the moment the smoking ruins of those Japanese aircraft carriers finally slipped beneath the Pacific waves, the fleet commander had already lost his longest war. It was the brutal, silent war for the truth, waged against an administrative machine that could never allow a rogue codebreaker to own the victory.